that don't take as long. Okay, so that homework 9, it's posted on Blackboard in addition to the paper copy that I've just given you. It's due a week from today at 4 o'clock. And then the following Thursday is when the project is due. And I know that some of you are getting to the point that you want to check your answers for the first 4 scenarios, and I haven't actually solved it for the 8 different students in the class yet. That's something that actually I'm looking forward to, but just especially with registration going right now, I've been getting a lot of questions from the civil engineering students about this class and that, and so I just haven't had a chance to work out the solution to the project yet, so I can't help you if you want to check your answers, but I'm hoping to do that in the coming days, and so that'll give us plenty of time to make sure everybody's on the right track who wants to check. All right, so today we're talking about inflation, and before we get into that, are there any schedule or announcement related questions that you want to ask? All right. Excuse me, guys. I unfortunately do have to take this. The bill is now at $400,000. $400,000. Luckily, we've got good insurance at Marshall. So I'm not going to have to pay all that, and the insurance company, they're good at negotiating with the hospital. So the hospital says they want $400,000. They're maybe going to get 10 or 15% of that, but it's a lot of money, right? People who don't have insurance, they're just in all kinds of trouble because the American healthcare system is just really, really broken. It's crazy. There are a few things. We're talking about inflation today. There's a few things that the costs have gone up faster than everything else, and that is energy, healthcare, and education. Those are the things where the prices have just accelerated beyond anything that's justifiable or understandable in terms of the rest of inflation. And we'll talk about why those particular sectors have had so much inflation. But first, let's talk about cars. Back in the 1950s, cars were a lot cheaper than they are now in terms of the number of dollars they cost. The 1950 Hudson, if you look at this car, it's enormous. Look how long that vehicle is, and you can get a sense for the scale of it by the fact that there's 3 adults sitting in the front seat, and they don't look like they're particularly close together. So not only is it a long car, but it's also a very wide car. They're huge. And so there's tons of material that goes into that. And how did they make cars back then? Victor, do you know?
What?
How did they make cars back then? Did they make them with robots?
No, everything by hand.
Everything by hand. Yeah, so it was way more labor intensive then compared to now. And so the assembly wasn't as mechanized, and the raw materials, if you think about getting the metal, that wasn't as mechanized and automated as it is now. You know, nowadays there are factories that help to, for example, make the steel, and they were able to nowadays move materials around like the ore more cheaply than they could then. So everything is cheaper now, except for that instead of a vehicle costing $23.65, and maybe even less, if you look at some of the used cars on this list, it's pretty low. But nowadays, you may spend $86,000 on a truck. You'll remember that we looked at this example earlier in the semester of the just kind of middle of the range truck that's selling for almost $100,000. So the question is, why do cars cost so much today compared to the fact that now they are using like robotic assembly, and they have the benefits of automation in mining and in metals processing, and the shipping costs are lower now because they're using gigantic container ships that are so much more efficient than the old methods of shipping. So, like, why are the costs so much higher now today? Do you have an idea of what are some of excuse me, what are some of the things that make a vehicle so much more expensive today than in the past?
Electronics.
Okay, electronics. Yeah, this car didn't have a flat screen in it. It didn't have anti-lock brakes. didn't have a backup camera, airbags. I don't think it even had seat belts, honestly. It wasn't until maybe like the 60s that cars started to become standard with seat belts. My mom always tells me that they had a car that had seat belts, just it was like an option, and they got them, and everyone thought it was so strange because until then, most people associated seat belts with airplanes. Like everybody who'd flown was in the habit of putting on a seat belt for the airplane, but in a car it was just very strange. So in part, it's because safety standards are higher nowadays. Also, it's a matter of comfort because, you know, the 1950 Hudson, it certainly didn't have air conditioning. I don't know, it may have had heat, but it probably didn't have like multi-zone heat where the passenger can set a different temperature than the driver, and that the back seat has its own temperature than the front. So cars are more expensive now because the standards have been raised. The safety standards are higher, the comfort standards are higher, the reliability has improved a lot. Those older vehicles had to have new spark plugs every 10 or 15,000 miles. They had to get the oil changed every 3,000 miles, where now most vehicles have like a 7,500 mile to 10,000 mile interval on the oil change. You won't have to change the spark plugs until maybe even 120,000 miles. And so the reliability and durability is better now, and that's part of why the costs are so high. But the main thing is just everything costs more now. It's not just limited only to cars. Labor is more costly than it was. Housing is more costly than it was. And so the inputs to a car, if you think about what goes into the car, it's the work from a person, it is the supplies that come from their suppliers, and so like the rubber that goes into the wheel, the plastic that goes into the tail light, the metal that goes into the body. All of those things have individual components become more expensive, and so obviously the whole is going to have to be more costly as well. So here's a figure that illustrates the rate of inflation. Did everybody get a copy of the handouts? Okay. This figure illustrates the rate of inflation from 1775 to 2015. So what do you notice about the figure? What are some things that stand out to you about this figure?
Between the Revolutionary and the Civil Wars, it looks like inflation increased quite a bit.
Okay, so you're noticing here's the Revolutionary War, and here's the Civil War, and you notice that it's a prolonged period of high inflation. That's a good observation. For other history buffs, where's another war?
World War.
Okay, here's World War I. What do we see? Pardon me?
The Depression?
What?
The Depression?
Oh, the Depression. So the Depression would be between World War I, which is here, and here's World War II. What happened during the Depression? The blue. The blue represents something that's called deflation. So inflation is where costs are going up over time. Deflation is the opposite of that. It's where costs are going down over time. Okay, so the first kind of thing that we noticed was that war seems to cause inflation. Do you have any idea why that is? Why does war cause inflation? Why would a war cause prices to go up? Who pays for war? Well, everybody eventually, but at first it's government spending. And so the government is spending a lot of money. What are they buying? Like they're buying, like in the case of maybe the Civil War, they're buying uniforms, they're buying food, they're buying wagons and guns and powder, all sorts of things, horses. So they're buying all these materials, and then those materials are getting either used up or destroyed. So then they have to get replaced. There's just a lot more consumption than there ordinarily would be. And so all of that excess consumption and excess spending reinforces high prices. And those high prices continue to kind of snowball and accumulate. So I think that's a pretty astute observation that, number one, these extended periods of high inflation correspond to wartime periods. And then the underlying reason, if you think about what is causing the high increase in prices, it's because demand. Remember, we've talked about demand versus supply. And so if demand is really high, the only way to make sure that there's an equilibrium between supply and demand is to increase prices. And if you increase prices, then some of the people who can find substitutions or who don't actually need the item as much, they're going to fall out of competition for the item. So the increase in price will reduce the demand. All right, so now one other point that I wanted to make is that over time, like compared to these older years, the inflation peaks were more high than they are now. It looks like the extremes have calmed down. Back in these earlier years, it would go high and then low and then high and then low. I could be jumping all over the place. Whereas in the modern era, since World War II, there hasn't been any deflation. Not much anyway. There's a little bit here during the financial crisis that was due to the housing bubble in 2008. And if we extended this into our modern age, there'd be a little bit of deflation during 2020. I remember driving by a gas station like during the first part of the pandemic. Do you remember 3 years ago, like about this time of year, 3 years ago, when the university was closed, businesses were closed, people were really staying home in early April of 2020. And I drove by the gas station, and I think gas was $1.79 a gallon. I took a picture. I'm going to have to go back and take a look, but it was so surprising to see gas that cheap because it had been, like 15, 20 years since I saw gas that cheap because there was no demand, and so the prices were low. But does anybody know why there isn't deflation now like there used to be? Like, why is it that the peaks aren't quite as wild as they used to be, and that the fact that there's no deflation anymore?
Part of me wants to say globalization, but
Mhm.
I'm not sure if that's correct.
I think it is related to globalization. I mean, it's one of the things that's helped to make globalization possible and to facilitate it. After the Great Depression, the United States created the Federal Reserve Bank, and the central bank in the United States had the dual authority to try to keep inflation steady and to promote full employment. And so the way that they did that is by managing the money supply more carefully. Like there was the gold standard for a lot of years where the economy was very volatile because if they found a new gold mine someplace like Argentina or South Africa, if there was suddenly a new gold mine that opened up and started producing a lot of gold, then suddenly that would change the amount of currency in the world in a way that didn't necessarily reflect the number of people or the number of goods and services. It was just an additional variable that could go up and down on its own. But with the creation of kind of modern day banking, they tried to stabilize things a little bit more, and they've been successful. The inflation isn't as high during the bad times than it used to be. Deflation has been all but eliminated. Now, whether there's going to be some big spectacular crash someday in the future, like a lot of people predict, I don't know. But I think the evidence shows that inflation has calmed down, and it's a lot easier to plan now. Like in the past, it was difficult to know whether you should expand your business. Like think about if you were owning a company and you're trying to decide, should you expand a product line or should you send your ship to some other part of the world to buy raw materials. Like, is it worth making that investment and taking the risk if you don't know if the economy is going to swing high versus swing low? Where things are more stable and predictable, it becomes easier to plan and easier to execute a profitable business venture. So if we zoom in on this modern era, here is an interesting relationship between wages and periods of recession. So there was a brief recession in the early 90s, and then there was, and I don't remember what caused this recession in the early 90s. Honestly, it doesn't stick in my mind. But I do remember this recession in 2001, which was kind of related to, they called it the first dot-com bust, like when a bunch of really stupid internet companies were starting to go bankrupt, like companies that sold pet food online in the early days when they hadn't yet figured out like cheap shipping and logistics and stuff. I think there's maybe profitable pet food companies who sell stuff on the internet now, but in the first internet age, there was a lot of really poor quality internet companies that kind of crashed all at the same time, and it put the country into recession. And then here, this recession was due to the bursting of the housing market. A recession is defined as a period of declining economic growth, where the value of the goods and services that are produced by the economy is going down rather than increasing. And so what do you notice about wages during periods of recession? So, you know, this on the vertical axis over here, it's wages. So it's the annual change in hourly earnings. And so what this is saying is every year, back in 1985, people's salary, well, the hourly wages were increasing 3% per year. But during periods of recession, what usually happens is it causes the wage growth to decline, and it even declines beyond the recession, usually. It kicks off the decline in wages, and it may continue to go down for a bit. But the reason for that is that when companies believe that the economy is contracting, then the companies will start to lay off workers. They call it belt tightening. You know, they're going on a diet, and so they're going to be shedding excess weight within their company. They're going to be letting employees go who they don't absolutely need. And so there's more people who are unemployed through the economy, and that additional pool of labor suppresses wage growth. Whereas like right now, wages have been growing really high. Like you'll notice if you're driving around, there's fast food places that are paying $15 an hour. And like that was a laughable notion 5 years ago. You know, when Bernie Sanders was running for president and he proposed a $15 per hour minimum wage, people thought, well, that's ridiculous to pay just like an ordinary restaurant worker in a fast food place $15 an hour. Like it was unthinkable. But now there's plenty of places, and the starting wages may be even higher in certain metro areas. Like I was out in Utah over Christmas break, and they have a really hot economy in Utah. The unemployment is really low. And so there's lots of places there that are advertising $18 or even $20 an hour for people just to start pretty unskilled jobs, like the kind of jobs that a high school student could get. The wages are really high because there's just really a lot of competition for any people who are willing to work. During the pandemic, a lot of people stayed home. Some people retired early and thought it's just not worth going into the office anymore. Pilots in particular decided to retire early during the pandemic. A lot of teachers got fed up with remote work and they retired early. And so kind of like these accelerated retirements decreased the pool of people in the workforce, and it's pushed wages up kind of a lot. So the effect that I wanted to point out on this figure is that price inflation seems to occur when wage growth occurs. So if you'll notice here, kind of the bumps in inflation, that's also overlapping with high wage growth. So, I mean, it makes sense that when people get more money, they're going to spend more money, and when there's more money chasing the same number of goods, the only way to respond to that is by increasing prices. So demand for goods increase when people have more money because they have more to spend. And then the other effect I wanted to point out is that recession, periods of economic contraction, suppresses wage growth. So when people are out of work, then the companies have less of incentive to increase the pay for their employees because they know that people are worried about losing their job, and so they don't have to entice the employees, or they don't have to maybe compete with their other companies quite as in the same way that they did before. So we're going to talk about some of the specific terms that you have to be aware of, and this is pretty fertile ground for concept questions on the final exam. Remember that our final exam is comprehensive, but it includes added emphasis on the material since the second midterm. So these are really important things to understand, and so I'd encourage you to go back over this in addition to what we talk about today. Review it later as well. What we mean by inflation is the increase in the amount of money needed to obtain the same goods or services. So what's inflating is the price. The rate of inflation is when we express it as a percent on an annual basis in the change in the value of currency. So we're going to be talking a lot today and next Tuesday about purchasing power. And your purchasing power is how many things you can buy with a certain amount of money. And one of the things is that if prices are increasing at this rate of F, so that's how expensive things are and how that's increasing over time, if your savings account interest rate is the same as the inflation rate, then what that means is that you have no gain in purchasing power. And I'll give you an illustration about that in a moment. But in fact, a lot of times the savings account interest rate is less than the inflation rate. That's what happens right now, where my savings account will pay 4%, but inflation is 8%. So that means actually, if I put money in the bank, I'm having a loss of purchasing power, because in the future, I'm not going to be able to buy as many things with the money that has grown as I can today, because the amount of money in my savings account is growing slower than the prices are growing. So if prices are growing faster than the money in my account, then I'm going to be able to buy fewer things in the future. So when we take these two things into account, the idea that prices can be growing and money supply can be growing, the real interest rate is what takes those two trends into account and represents your gain in purchasing power, if it's positive. If the real interest rate is negative, then that means that you've experienced a loss in purchasing power. So I'm going to show you a formula that explains how to relate the interest rate that is like the real interest rate that you want to achieve, and the market interest rate, which is quoted by banks, and then the inflation rate F. So let's say that P means present, same as it has in the past when we've used these time value of money factors. F means some amount of money in the future. If you want to take into account both the rate of inflation, which is F, and the increase in purchasing power, which is I, then you're going to have to multiply them together according to what's shown in the denominator there. And one of the terms accounts for inflation, one counts for interest, and when multiplied together, you take both into account. So this market interest rate, I sub F, which is sometimes also called the inflation adjusted interest rate, it takes into account the increase in purchasing power that you want to have, I, the inflation rate, F, and then you have to also multiply the two together and then add these three terms together. And this is the market interest rate. So this is a bit confusing, but I think through a couple of examples today we'll make it clear. First of all, to talk about the idea of purchasing power, let's just say that there's like a basket of goods that you need to buy every so often. It could be groceries, as is illustrated here, but I mean, you could just as easily think about you know, what are the things that you buy every month? You buy a certain amount of electricity, you buy some gasoline every month, maybe you buy one airline ticket and a shirt, a pair of pants, maybe, you know, if you get shoes every 6 months, then you'd say you buy 1/6 of a pair of shoes every month and so on. But there's just these things that you need to buy. And let's say that today you can buy some basket of goods for $25, a certain basket of goods. And if the inflation rate is 3%, and we want to know what's the price in 15 years, then remember in the past what we've said is future is present times 1 plus I to the n, where I was an interest rate. Here, we just adapt that same idea, but we're going to replace I with F. So if we want to know what is the future cost of this basket, then it would be the present cost, which is 25, multiplied by 1.03, because it's 3% inflation, and n is 15 years. So with that, we can find out that the price of the basket of goods in 15 years is going to be $38.95. So we can, since it's a percent, it's the rate of increase expressed on an annual basis, this F value here, we can treat in the same way that we treated the interest rate, I. So the basket will cost $38.95. Now, that's how much it's going to cost in 15 years. But let's say, what if you put $25 into the bank now, and the bank is paying 7%? So the cost of the food, $38.95, food cost. So the money amount is going to be the same formula. How much money you have in the future is the amount of money you have at the present, 1 plus I to the n. Okay, so it's, you put $25 into an account that's paying 7%, so it's 1.07 to the 15th power. So that means that it's going to be in your account $68.98. And so you have more dollars than you need. If the basket only costs you $38.95 and you have $68.98, that means you can buy more than one basket of food. You could buy 1.77 baskets. Or you could buy the basket of food and have money left over. So this is a scenario where you have an increase in purchasing power. The purchasing power increased because the interest rate was larger than the inflation rate. So we had a good real rate of return. So this is saying the market interest rate. So let's identify these variables. So we had F was 0.03. I sub F was 7%, 0.07. And then the formula that relates all of them is here. Okay, so let me write this below. Okay, so I sub F is I plus F plus I times F. Okay, I sub F is the market adjusted interest rate. That's what the bank actually pays. They pay some actual rate. So 0.07 is equal to I plus F was 0.03, 0.03 plus I times F. So 0.03 times I. Okay, so solve for I. In this case, what was the increase in purchasing power expressed as a percentage? So we can subtract the 0.03 from both sides. So 0.04 is equal to 1.03 times I. Because here we have 1I, here's 0.03I, add them together. So I it's 0.04 divided by 1.03. Let's see. 0.04, 1.03. Oh, my calculator's not ready for that. 0.04 divided by 1.03. Do you get 0.0388?
That's what I got.
Okay, so it's 3.88%. But what is this? What is 3.88%? That's the rate of increase in your purchasing power. So that's what we would call the real interest rate. So the market interest rate is what the bank wants you to fixate on. You know, oh, we're going to pay you like my bank, where they're paying me 4% interest right now. Well, that's nice. It's better than zero. But since inflation right now is maybe 8%, my real interest rate is negative at the moment. Like I'm experiencing a loss of purchasing power. But in this example that we just worked with the basket of foods, since you can buy more in the future than you could at time zero, the real interest rate, I equals the real interest rate. Anytime this is positive, above zero, it means that you can buy more in the future than you can today. Okay, so does everybody understand the difference between the real interest rate and the market interest rate? The real interest rate kind of subtracts out the effect of inflation to tell you, can you buy more in the future or can you buy less? All right, so let's put this into practice. I've got an in-class exercise for you today where we're going to look at the effects of inflation. All right, so feel free to work together in small groups on this one. Okay, so you know, it's helpful sometimes to identify the variable in the statement. And so like the present value is 5,000. That's how much the item costs now. F is 0.04. N equals 5. So if we know that the item is getting 4% more expensive every year, then it only takes 5 years to go from $5,000 to $6,083.26. So that's a significant increase in price just over 4 years. And the thing is that it's compounded, right? It's not simple, it's compounded. In the same way that interest is, inflation also compounds. When expressed as an ongoing and recurring annual increase, then the past increases also come into play. So then the real interest rate of 10%, if you want to have an increase in purchasing power every year of 10% in an environment where inflation is 4%, then that means that you have to get paid 14.4%, because you can think of inflation as kind of like a tax. The inflation is going to be taking away some of it, and so you need to earn even more than the real interest rate you hope to achieve. So 14.4% is I sub F. And so then if you are going to earn that 14.4%, assuming that, then you'd have to only deposit $3,104.60 today to purchase the item in 5 years. So any questions about this one? As I circulated around, it seemed like folks had gotten these answers. So the homework is similar to this, like quick problems, where what you're really doing is you're just reading the statement and try and identify the variables so that you can find out, okay, it's asking, if you put some money in the bank now, how much do you have to put in the bank now? If prices are going up at one rate, but you're earning interest at a different rate. So there's two different rates that you're keeping track of simultaneously. This illustrates those ideas. All right. Now, in the second problem, it was talking about a plane that doesn't have very much demand anymore. People were sure enthralled by the Airbus 380 when they first came out because, it's a double-decker plane. It's huge. It's very luxurious. I've only got to fly on an Airbus 380 one time, but it is a very comfortable airplane. It's quiet. There's plenty of room because it's huge. But do you know why these aren't very popular now? It's because it has 4 engines. And 4 engines is less efficient than 2 engines. And so all the Airbus 380s went into like mothballs during the pandemic. Some of them are starting to fly again now, especially with this coming summer. There's a lot of demand for international travel. And so some of the Airbus 380s that were put in storage are being refurbished and outfitted again. But the planes that get a lot more use now is like the Airbus 330, the Airbus 350. Those are both 2-engine planes. The Boeing 777 or 787 both only have 2 engines. And the Boeing plane that's less popular now is the 747, which has 4 engines and is less fuel efficient. So in this one, let's just say that the price now is $340 million. And if we expect inflation of 9% per year, how long until the cost is $500 million? So I've written on the board, our relationship between present and future. And I wrote it in terms of I, but I guess we could say the same thing if it's in terms of F. So if we just divide both sides by P and take the log of both sides, what we want to do is solve for N. So how many years until the price is $500 million? Did anybody solve that already?
I got 4.475.
Yeah, me too.
Good. That's right. Yeah, so let me show the solution for that.
My calculator was able to solve it in both ways,
Mhm.
both using log and without using log.
Good. Good. Yeah, if you want to solve it directly, like algebraically, then you can use the log function. But if you just put the numbers into the solver, you could just leave it as this and solve for n, if you've got a solver on your calculator. So, yeah, the price now is $340 million. We want to know how many years until the price is up to $500 million. The reality is now that they're almost practically giving them away. Their price is so much lower than it was before. The demand for this kind of gas guzzler plane has really gone down. But this still illustrates the principle of solving for a price in some future time. Okay, one more problem. You're going to have to write this one on the page because I didn't include it in the printout. But here's the problem. It's up on the screen. Let me make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. All right, let's say that your bank is bragging about its money market account, the nation's highest yield, and what it pays is 1.25%. So what's the name of this variable? This 1.25%, is that F, is that I, or is it I sub F? It's I sub F. It's not F. It's obviously that's not inflation. What they pay you is just the market interest rate. I is the real interest rate that represents your increase in purchasing power. So the bank doesn't promise you an increase in purchasing power. They just promise you whatever rate they're paying. So they pay you I sub f. Okay, now inflation is 3%, so that's F. You're putting in $110,000 at the present, and N equals 8. So I'm going to pause and give you a chance to calculate how much money would be in the account at the end of 8 years. So for that, you'll use I sub F. The present value of the accumulated amount, you'll discount from the future to the present using F. The real interest rate, you can use just this formula to solve for I in the same way that I demonstrated on the whiteboard earlier. And then the last question is about if you want to have a real interest rate, meaning I of 1.25%, then what would I sub F need to be? Okay, so part A is asking you how much money will be in the account. You put in 110,000 and the account is earning 1.25%. That's how much the bank is actually paying. So what's actually the number of dollars in the account after 8 years? So the number of dollars in the account after 8 years should be 121,493 because we're solving for the future number of dollars, F, starting with $110,000 as P, and then the inflation, the market interest rate, sometimes called the inflation adjusted interest rate, is what we put into the interest rate here for I sub F. So that's how many dollars you'll have in 8 years. Now, what is the present value of that if you discount it using the inflation rate? So this is kind of interesting because it's going to be your first indication that you're getting ripped off in this scenario. So if you have $100,000, deposit $110,000 into the bank, and it grows for 8 years, but inflation is larger than the interest rate, then the present value of that future amount is only like $95,908. So this illustrates that you're losing money because the present value of your future number of dollars is less than how much you actually put into the account. So what we're going to see is that the real interest rate is negative. Anytime, and this is true, anytime inflation is larger than the market interest rate. If the market interest rate is 1.25% and the inflation rate is 3, then what that tells us is that we have a negative real interest rate. It's negative 1.7%. So this is bad. And so the hypothetical in part D is just, if the bank wants to pay you a real interest rate of 1.25%, then the market interest rate they're going to have to pay would be 4.2875%, because it's going to have to be covering the inflation effect plus the real interest rate that you're making plus the product of the two. Okay, so that's the solution to this last one. And hopefully between this example and the other two, that should give you a pretty good head start on working on the homework assignment that's due a week from today. All right, well that's it for today. We're out of time, but if you have any questions as you're working on the assignment, then please let me know. I'll see you on Tuesday.